It's a first for Whiskey and Whiskey. Let's drink some bourbon. Some straight Kentucky bourbon, that is. Welcome to Whiskey and Whiskey and Christy's bar, Kilkenny. Whiskey Chaser Brian. And a first for the channel, something different from me too, as I wouldn't normally drink bourbons. Okay, so as the show is named Whiskey and Whiskey, spelt with the E and without the E, I figured why not do a bourbon today? When I initially started the channel and named it Whiskey and Whiskey, everyone thought I was actually going to do all types of world whiskies because of the spellings. But in fact, what a lot of people don't know, in Ireland you can spell whiskey two ways. One with the E, one without the E. Initially the channel was all about Irish whiskey, you know, because of the spelling. Look, it made sense to me. I don't know. In going with the flow, and as an amateur whiskey enthusiast, it can't hurt to branch out and try new things, and this is what we have today. Not newly released, but certainly new to me. Definitely. This is Colonel E.H. Taylor, small batch release from Buffalo Trace. So yeah, totally new to bourbon, never really dove too much into it as I, naturally always drank Irish. Being in Ireland, it was my first go-to whiskey, but it's nice to change it up every now and then and, try things different. It can't hurt. I don't know much about the brand or even the history of bourbon itself, so I guess this is really a nice way to get to know it and to check out some of the flavor profiles of different bourbons. This one here seems to be a favorite of many bourbon drinkers, so let's do it. In typical Chaser style, I did a bit of research into the whole brand as well as the bourbon itself, and there are a lot of definitions I need to arm myself with so that I know what they are when they're found on the label. Normally, you wouldn't see some of the definitions on an Irish whiskey label. They're totally different spirits, and therefore, obviously, there will be totally different regulations between the two, and totally different countries from totally different parts of the world. Bourbon itself has been around since the 1820s. Before that, early settlers in the USA had distilled spirits typically flavored with fruits and sugars, but not until the 1820s did aged spirits really come along. The first written mention of bourbon whiskey is from an 1821 issue of Western Citizen newspaper. Aging the whiskey in a charred barrel is what makes bourbon. It's not really known who first did this, but there is an earlier mention of charring a whiskey barrel from 1826 as a Lexington grocer writes to distiller John Corliss, telling him he has heard that charring the inside of the barrel will improve the flavor of the whiskey. In the 1830s, and I hope I have my names right here, when James Christopher Crowe goes to work for Oscar Pepper as a distiller, Crowe uses scientific methods to understand the distilling process and records the results. In doing this, he was able to reference his notes with each batch to produce a more quality bourbon. Moving along, after the American Civil War, the industry grew as the use of steam power, the invention of the column still by Aeneas Coffey in the 1830s, and the railroad all combined to make large distilleries successful. In 1870, George Garvin Brown introduced the first bourbon to be sold by the bottle, Old Forester. But for most of the 19th century, the primary package for the distiller was the barrel, as consumers would bring in their own flask, jug, or bottle to purchase their own whiskey from the saloon or liquor store. It was during the 1870s E.H. Taylor Jr. takes advantage of new technology and marketing methods to promote his OFC whiskey. He developed a full-size trademark for his barrel heads and makes his barrels with brass instead of iron hoops. Moving along to during the 1880s is when we start to see a lot more variety of bourbon brands as well as more widely available whiskey by the bottle. It was also around this time that the USA starts to see the introduction of rectifiers, which I found out by Irish comparison these days is basically a form of bonder and blender. It was actually the rectifiers that were flooding the market with cheap whiskey and calling it bourbon. And it was this that led to the Bottled and Bond Act of 1897. Where have we seen that before in Irish history? The beginning of the 20th century saw further friction between the rectifiers and the distillers with the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906. The question became, what was pure food whiskey? This was answered in 1909 when President Taft defined the categories known today as straight and blended whiskies. In 1919, what nearly destroyed the Irish whiskey market shuts down all of the distilleries in the US. Prohibition. Within the distilleries, the barrels were private property, and as long as they didn't sell the whiskey illegally, the government would not take away their bourbon. I did not know that. 6 companies applied for and received licenses to sell spirits as medicine during Prohibition. People could purchase 1 pint of 100 proof spirits every 10 days for medical use. The distilleries could sell to pharmacies as a result. They could also sell 12 pints of spirits a year to doctors and dentists. Lucky. Thankfully, Prohibition comes to an end on December 5th, 1933. For Ireland, the damage had been done. The USA too, but not so much. Now, as one would imagine, along with the ending of Prohibition, there were new liquor regulations. The federal government made new rules like standard bottle sizes and label requirements. In 1938, a regulation came in making new cooperage required for straight whiskey. And finally, in 1964, the United States government passed a resolution making bourbon a product of the United States. Now, as we get a little bit more modern, during the 60s, 70s, and 80s, bourbon really took a backseat as a result of overproduction and the younger generation's change in taste, which led to cheap prices. More recently though, this did change around a bit with the introduction of super premium bourbons and small batch brands, which revitalized the category totally. These days, it's tremendously popular and has regained its seat at the top of the table as drinkers come to appreciate quality and taste of well-made bourbon by longtime distillers and new craft distilleries. E.H. Taylor, or Edmund Hines Taylor Jr., was a bourbon pioneer, mayor, state representative, and the grandson of President Zachary Taylor. Taylor started and owned 7 different distilleries throughout his career, the most successful being the OFC and Carlisle distilleries, which are the forerunners of today's Buffalo Trace distillery. He is said to have lobbied in favor of the Bottled in Bond Act, a law that gave participating whiskey producers a tax break and a government certification of product quality. So then Buffalo Trace Distillery is a distillery in Kentucky, owned by the Sazerac Company and producers of a wide number of spirits. Actually, there are about 22 brands that the distillery produces. Everything from Buffalo Trace whiskey to Van Winkle, George C. Stagg, E.H. Taylor. And actually, E.H. Taylor is a premium version of Old Taylor bourbon, producing small batch, single barrel, and barrel proof versions of bourbon as well as rye whiskeys. Now you know. Thank you, Wikipedia. There is a lot more information on the brand and Buffalo Trace itself. I'm not going to go into that in this video. There will be plenty more chances to go into that down the road. I'm just going to keep this a bit nerdy on the bourbon itself for the time being. It's going to be a long video. Try and stay with me. A few terms you should familiarize yourself with if and when you do decide to drink bourbon whiskey. Firstly, bourbon is legally protected under Title 27 of the Code of Federal Regulations as acknowledged in 1964 by the US Congress. To be recognized as bourbon, the following must be met. It must be made in the United States, any state, not just Kentucky. It must be made of at least 51% corn. It must be distilled at no higher than 160 proof. It must be barreled at no higher than 125 proof. It must be put in a new charred oak container, not necessarily a barrel. And everything else is simply called whiskey. Know this. This is important. There is absolutely no food coloring whatsoever allowed in bourbon. Period. End of. Straight bourbon. To be classified as straight bourbon, it has to conform to all the guidelines for bourbon and be aged in a charred oak container for at least 2 years. If it is aged less than 4 years, an age statement must appear on the label. Kentucky straight bourbon. To be classified Kentucky straight bourbon, the guidelines of straight bourbon must be adhered to, in addition to having been distilled and aged for at least 1 year in Kentucky. Small batch. This implies that all the contents of the bottle came from a small batch of barrels vatted together to achieve a desired taste. Unfortunately, there is no legal definition applied, so the batch could be 10 barrels, 40 barrels, or some other nondescript number of barrels. Who knows? This next one is kind of big. Might want to pay attention. Maybe write it down. Bottled in Bond, exclusive to the US of A. These are a class of distilled spirits aged and bottled according to the regulations put in place by the Bottled in Bond Act of 1897. In order for a whiskey to meet the requirements, it must be distilled in its entirety by a single distiller in a single American distillery within the course of a single year. Following its creation, it must also go through a 4-year aging process under government supervision in a federally bonded facility. And finally, it must be bottled at 100 proof, which is 50% ABV. I nearly said 55. 50% ABV. All will make sense now as we drink. Look, the more you know and all of that. That was a lot of information. Take a break for a second while I say this next part. So look, genuinely, it did take a long ass time to get all that info together for you and present it in one neatly delivered package that you see here. Don't forget to subscribe and give a thumbs up. Thank you. Doing some research, I have found out this whiskey recipe is mash, what they call mash number 1 from Buffalo Trace. They keep incredibly secretive about their mash bill ingredients, but I can tell you that no fewer than 26 whiskeys from the distillery use this exact same mash bill, which is speculation, to be less than 10% rye, 75% corn, and 15% barley. Even though many of the products start with the same mix of grains, Buffalo Trace can make big changes in the flavor profiles by aging them in different warehouses on different tiers for different lengths of time and releasing them at varying proofs. Now, the MSRP in the States is approximately $40. Generally, it runs up to $60. And I recently checked on Irish websites today, and if you can find it, expect to pay somewhere around 140 euros, which is the equivalent of $155. Rip off Republic. This is E.H. Taylor Small Batch Straight Kentucky Bourbon Whiskey, bottled in bond at 100 proof or 50% ABV. I have broken all that down, all those definitions. This is a small batch bourbon, I think I said that, and has been aged inside the old warehouses that were actually constructed by E.H. Taylor Jr. back in the day. So, let's have a little nose, shall we? And we'll get this baby in the palate. It's quite nice. On the nose, straight away, you get that hit of spice. It's mild enough, but it's showing its cask strength at 50% or 100 proof. I'm getting kind of a popcorn nose, like a toffee popcorn, and there's a very, very obvious raisin note, like a dark fruit note, like that. There's vanilla. There is an earthiness to the whiskey that is obviously on the corn husk side of things, I would say. But it is subtle. And there is a slight hint of nuttiness too. I'm guessing that's from the oak barrel thing to it. I could be 100% wrong there, but quite a nice nose. Quite a nice nose. On the palate, Sláinte, as we say here, or cheers in the States. Interesting. So, where on the nose I had more of a toffee popcorn note, now is more of a vanilla cream kind of meets raisins. There's some lovely woody kind of tannins in there also. You're getting a lot more of the cask coming through there. Nice hit of heat from the spice, which is more of a kind of a cinnamon-y, peppery spice. Cinnamon/pepper spice. There really is a lovely vanilla sweetness, even on the verge of a slight kind of confectionery note to it. It certainly has a grain earthiness in there. Little at the end. I think it's an obvious corn note for me. It is, you know, I would say a semi-complicated whiskey. Let's one more sip and let's see what the finish is like. Again, your woody tannins. Still very sweet. The sweetness is lovely on it. It's really carrying through the whole way. It's that confectionery coating on the tongue. A little bit of grain aftertaste, again, more so in the form of the earthiness, even kind of borderline tobacco, I would say. That earthiness note, definitely. Love the spicy notes, has real hang time. Still heat, nose matches up with the palate, matches up with the finish. Even now I'm kind of getting more of a caramel kind of decadence on the finish to it. So yeah, I think that for the price point here in Ireland at 140 euros-ish, I would walk on by this expression. I don't think any non-age statement whiskey commands a price like that, regardless of how scarce they are or how selectively distributed they are here. But if I lived in the States and I could get this in or around the MSRP, right, of between $40 and $60-ish, depending on state, I would be all over this. it would be a regular drink for me. I would have it on the shelf all the time. Has the bite, complexity, drinkability you'd want from that price point, and outshines even some of, you know, the nice Irish whiskey that I've had at that price point too. Not bad at all. I mean, for my first bourbon, I'm impressed. Very good. Again, flavor-wise, really enjoyable. I think I'm gonna have to incorporate more bourbons on the channel as a result of that here and kind of up my game a bit, so I'll put it out to you viewers there. Any recommendations you think I should try on my next bourbon? Leave a comment down below with your suggestions. And as always, I will leave all the relevant links in the description box for you guys to check out. Don't forget to join my Facebook group too, Whiskey and Whiskey, if you haven't already. Link below for that also. And of course, thank you to the lads here in Christy's bar for hooking me up with the sample. As always, all thoughts are my own. Until the next video, be safe, chaser out. Sláinte.